Strengths and weaknesses. No matter who we are or what our circumstances, we must be cautious so that our greatest strengths do not become our greatest weaknesses. Here's Gene to explain.
Now, David had a lot of strengths. We know that from the Scriptures. Lots of strengths. Down deep, he was a man after God's heart. We know that. God said that. God saw a heart that really wanted to follow God from the time he was just a young man. We know that David believed in justice. In fact, he believed in justice when he should have been guilty of justice on his own life. But he believed in justice, and we see him trying to fulfill his responsibility to God in being a leader who really was just and meted out justice when it needed to be done. Another strength, he defended the Lord's name. Remember when he went out to do battle against Goliath? As just a young man, he said, "You come in the strength of your armor and who you are, but I come in the name of the Lord." And so, David would defend the Lord's name. In fact, he was very, very offended by Goliath and some of the things that he was saying about his God. And so, he had that great strength. He was deeply sensitive. He had a very, very sensitive heart. And he would overreact somewhat. And we see that problem in his life. He would not harm Saul. For example, even when Saul tried to murder him, and he had an opportunity to take Saul's life, he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't harm him because he was the Lord's anointed. Even though he was a very sinful man, David wouldn't harm him. And he was a loyal friend. He was loyal to a fault almost. And certainly his relationship with Jonathan really proves that. So here we have David's strengths. They're throughout the whole basic story. But he also had some great weaknesses. And here is where the principle, I think, applies. That we can have great strengths, but our strengths can become some of our greatest weaknesses. And here, David's weaknesses, his sensitive spirit, for example, and his sense of loyalty became his greatest weakness, particularly in dealing with his own children. His great strengths became a weakness. And there are a couple of examples I could share with you from the passage in 2 Samuel 14:33, where there is restoration without repentance, where he restored his son Absalom. He deeply loved his son. But there's no sign that Absalom ever really repented for what he did. And we read about this. Joab, who was his chief officer of his army, Joab went to the king and told him. So David summoned Absalom, who came to the king, bowed down with his face to the ground before him, and then the king kissed Absalom. And this was after Absalom had left the king's presence for 3 years and then was brought back, and then eventually was brought to the king. And as far as we know, never repented. And yet, in his sensitivity and his love for Absalom, he loved this man, this son, deeply. Without repentance, he gave him a high position. And I think, again, what we see here is his great strength became a great weakness. Another very interesting scenario here in chapter 14 of 2 Samuel. He was vulnerable to flattery. Basically, the verse we read here in verse 17, your servant thought, may the word of my Lord the king bring relief, for my Lord the king is able to discern the good and the bad like the angel of God. May the Lord your God be with you. And here, basically, in order to trick David, to get him to, in some respects, Joab's plan was to restore Absalom. So Joab got this woman who was a very clever woman. Everybody knew she was smart, manipulative, controlling, and she comes into the king's presence and weaves this real a story that wasn't true, but it related to David restoring Absalom. And then she said there, in his presence, may the word of my Lord the King bring relief, for my Lord the King is able to discern. Now, this is in relationship to her own situation about her own son. And it's a story to manipulate David regarding Absalom. And so she says, for my Lord the King is able to discern the good and the bad like the angel of God. Whoa. That kind of can get to you in terms of what you think about yourself based on what other people think of you. Now, we all need positive feedback, but this kind of feedback is flattery. This is manipulation. And then she even prays, may the Lord your God be with you. Well, as a result of that situation, he responded to flattery, and he made some bad decisions. And part of that decision was to restore Absalom without seeing real repentance in his son. So I think we can give a lesson, because I think we're all subject to flattery. Doesn't mean we shouldn't give people positive feedback. Doesn't mean we shouldn't receive positive feedback. We all need mutual encouragement. But there is such a thing as a flattery that we begin to believe the things that really we shouldn't believe about ourselves. And David, I think, became vulnerable to that. And that, of course, was part of his, in a sense, of his own strengths, because he was extremely sensitive and he could honor other people. But in this case, it went in the wrong direction and led him into a prideful situation. I think as we go to the New Testament, there are two dimensions of love that I see, which I think all of us need to be aware of. In Romans 15:7, we read these words from Paul. Therefore, accept one another. We all need mutual acceptance. And we're to accept each other as the Messiah also accepted us, to the glory of God. Now, if you want to see David taking that to an extreme, he accepted Absalom regardless of what he did. And that's not what Paul's teaching. We're to accept one another. We all need that mutual acceptance. But if you go down to verse 14 in the same chapter, we read, now, my brothers, sisters, I myself am convinced about you that you also are full of goodness. Yes, he commends them for that. You're filled with all knowledge. He commends them for that. And you're able to instruct one another, or more specifically, to admonish one another. And we need that balance in our lives, to accept one another, but we also need to instruct one another, to care for one another, to watch out for one another in relationship to where sin may be creeping into our lives. We're not to judge one another, but we're certainly to hold each other accountable and minister to each other. Well, this leads to a reflection and response question. To think about this principle. In what other specific ways can our strengths become weaknesses in our various relationships in life? And what specific precautions should we take to avoid this human tendency? And as I think about this principle, as I think back on my life, I think one of my greatest strengths is to trust people. I find it very easy to trust people. Maybe it's because I like to be trusted. But I find it easy to trust people. I find it easy to believe people. And I remember a spiritual leader, fellow elder, after I made some pretty bad judgments in a situation, who said to me one day, Gene, your greatest strength is to trust people. Nice positive feedback. But he said, your greatest weakness is to trust people you shouldn't trust. And he was right. He was right. As I reflected back, that was true. In fact, I had another man say to me one time, he said, Gene, you know what your problem is? He says, you believe people will treat you the way you treat them. Now, that was a compliment. but it was also an admonition. You believe people will treat you the way you treat them. And he went on to say, it just isn't true. It just isn't true. There are people out there that will take advantage of your trust. They will manipulate your trust. They will violate your trust. They'll operate out of selfishness rather than mutual trust and respectability and responding to that kind of trust. Now, what's the lesson for me? That I become untrusting? You can't be a good leader without trusting. The lesson for me was to be more discerning, less naive. And that's something I had to learn over the years. Now, I still make mistakes along the way. If I had to err, I want to err on trust. But the fact is, I've learned to ask the hard questions. And one of the things that's really hard for me is to ask the tough, hard questions, because I don't like to offend people. Maybe I don't like to offend people because I don't want them to mistrust me, or I don't want to hurt them, but I don't want to be hurt myself. So I have to look, at all of these strengths, and yet the greater the strengths, the greater sometimes our weaknesses. And I think David is a classic example of that. And of course, we can apply it to different situations, and that's why in this question I say, in what other specific ways can our strengths become weaknesses in our various relationships in life, and what specific precautions should we take to avoid this human tendency? Now, David had specifics in his life that we hopefully do not have in our own lives, but the fact of the matter is, we can be guilty of the very same thing in other situations. So it's something to really think about, I believe, when it comes to this particular principle.